The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling Los Angeles estate of billionaire real estate mogul Maximilian Rothschild. Amidst the opulent surroundings, a lone figure stood out, not for his extravagance, but for his simplicity. Jake Thompson, a man in his early 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands, carefully polished the fleet of luxury vehicles parked in the mansion's expansive garage. As Jake meticulously worked on a gleaming Rolls-Royce, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his circumstances. Once a promising engineering student at MIT, Jake had been forced to abandon his dreams when his father fell gravely ill. Now, years later, he found himself working as a driver and handyman for one of the wealthiest men in America. Thompson, a sharp voice cut through the air, causing Jake to flinch. Maximilian Rothschild strode into the garage, his expensive Italian loafers clicking against the polished floor. "I need you to drive me to an important meeting downtown. And for God's sake, try not to embarrass me this time." Jake nodded respectfully, trying to ignore the sting of Maximilian's words. "Of course, Mr. Rothschild. I'll bring the car around right away." As Jake hurried to prepare the vehicle, he couldn't help but reflect on the cruel twist of fate that had brought him here. He thought of his ailing father, now residing in a modest nursing home, and of the sister he struggled to support through college. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. Little did Jake know that this day would mark the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. The sleek black limousine glided through the bustling streets of Los Angeles, carrying Maximilian Rothschild to his high-stakes meeting. Jake expertly navigated the traffic, his eyes focused on the road ahead while his ears reluctantly absorbed the arrogant chatter of his employer in the back seat. "Remember, Thompson," Maximilian's voice dripped with condescension, "when we arrive, you are to remain with the car. I can't have you bumbling around and potentially ruining this deal." "Yes, Mr. Rothschild," Jake replied softly, suppressing a sigh. As they approached a red light, Jake's attention was drawn to a young woman standing on the sidewalk. Her bright red hair caught the sunlight, and there was something hauntingly familiar about her features. His heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned on him. "Emily," he whispered, hardly daring to believe his eyes. The woman turned, and their gazes locked. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Emily's eyes widened in shock, and she took a step towards the car. But before Jake could react, the light turned green, and the impatient honk of a car behind them jolted him back to reality. "What are you waiting for, you imbecile?" Maximilian barked from the back seat. "Drive!" With a heavy heart, Jake pressed the accelerator, leaving Emily behind. His mind raced with questions and memories. Emily had been his high school sweetheart, the one person who had truly understood him. They had planned a future together, but when Jake's father fell ill and he had to leave college, Emily had disappeared without a word. Now, after all these years, she had reappeared like a ghost from his past. Jake's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he struggled to focus on the road ahead. Little did he know that this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would unravel the carefully constructed world of lies and secrets surrounding him. The rest of the drive passed in a blur for Jake, his mind consumed by thoughts of Emily. As he pulled up to the towering skyscraper where Maximilian's meeting was to take place, he barely registered his employer's final cutting remarks before the billionaire swept out of the car. Left alone with his thoughts, Jake's mind wandered back to happier times. He remembered lazy summer afternoons spent with Emily by the lake, making plans for their future. Her laughter, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, echoed in his memory. A sharp rap on the window startled Jake from his reverie. He looked up to see a vaguely familiar face peering in at him. The man, dressed in an expensive suit, gestured for Jake to lower the window. "Jake Thompson?" the man asked, his voice laced with an undercurrent of urgency. Jake nodded, confusion evident on his face. "My name is David Hawkins. I was a friend of your father's," the man said, glancing around nervously. There's something you need to know. Your father, he wasn't who you thought he was. Jake's heart began to race. What do you mean? My father was a simple accountant. David shook his head, his expression grave. That was just a cover. Your father worked for a secret government agency. And the accident that put him in the nursing home, it wasn't an accident at all. Before Jake could process this earth-shattering revelation, David pressed a small USB drive into his hand. Everything you need to know is on here. But be careful, Jake. There are powerful people who don't want this information to come to light. With one last meaningful look, David disappeared into the crowd, leaving Jake reeling from the encounter. As Jake sat there, clutching the USB drive, his world began to tilt on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his father, and the circumstances that had led him to this point suddenly seemed suspect. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a web of lies, deceit, and danger that would soon envelop him. While Jake grappled with the shocking revelations outside, Maximilian Rothschild strode confidently into the opulent boardroom on the top floor of the skyscraper. The room was filled with some of the most influential figures in the business world, all gathered for what promised to be a game-changing merger. As Maximilian took his seat at the head of the table, his eyes locked with those of his chief rival, Victoria Blackwood. The tension between them was palpable, a result of years of cutthroat competition and personal animosity. Maximilian, Victoria purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. How kind of you to grace us with your presence. I trust your driver managed to get you here without incident? Maximilian's jaw clenched at the thinly veiled insult. My staff's competence is not up for discussion, Victoria. Let's focus on the matter at hand, shall we? As the meeting progressed, it became clear that the proposed merger was more than just a business deal. It was a power play, with each party vying for control. Maximilian presented his proposal with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, but Victoria countered each point with razor-sharp precision. The other board members watched the verbal sparring match with a mixture of awe and trepidation. It was clear that more than just money was at stake here, reputations and legacies hung in the balance. As the discussion reached a fever pitch, Victoria played her trump card. Before we proceed any further, she said, her eyes glinting with malice, I think there's something the board should know about Mr. Rothschild's business practices. Maximilian felt a chill run down his spine. Could she possibly know about? Victoria produced a folder and began to read, her voice ringing out in the suddenly silent room. It seems our esteemed colleague has been engaging in some rather questionable financial maneuvers. Tax evasion, insider trading, and, oh my, is that embezzlement I see? The color drained from Maximilian's face as Victoria laid bare his carefully hidden secrets. The other board members murmured in shock and disapproval. This is preposterous. Maximilian thundered, slamming his fist on the table. These are baseless accusations. But the damage was done. As Maximilian looked around the room, he saw only distrust and condemnation in the eyes of his peers. His carefully constructed empire was crumbling before his eyes. As the meeting descended into chaos, Maximilian's mind raced. How had Victoria obtained this information? And more importantly, how could he salvage his reputation and his company? Little did he know that the answers to these questions were closer than he thought, and that his life was about to become inextricably linked with that of his humble driver waiting outside. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Jake sat in the limousine, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The USB drive David had given him felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. He longed to plug it in and uncover its secrets, but fear held him back. What truths about his father and himself would he discover? His reverie was interrupted by the sight of Maximilian Rothschild storming out of the building, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Jake quickly straightened up, preparing himself for the inevitable outburst. Maximilian threw open the car door and flung himself into the back seat. "Drive," he barked, his voice trembling with rage. As Jake pulled away from the curb, he couldn't help but notice the stark difference in Maximilian's demeanor. Gone was the arrogant, self-assured tycoon. In his place sat a man on the edge, his carefully manicured fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on his knee. "Is everything all right, Mr. Rothschild?" Jake ventured cautiously. Maximilian's eyes snapped to meet Jake's in the rearview mirror. For a moment, Jake thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in those steel-gray eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the familiar cold disdain. "Mind your own business, Thompson," Maximilian snapped. "Just get me home. And step on it." As they sped through the darkening streets of Los Angeles, Jake's mind wandered back to Emily. The shock of seeing her after all these years had rekindled feelings he thought long buried. He wondered where she was now, what she was doing. Did she ever think of him? Suddenly, a sleek red sports car cut in front of them, forcing Jake to slam on the brakes. Maximilian was thrown forward, cursing loudly. "Watch where you're going, you incompetent fool," he shouted. But Jake's attention was fixed on the car in front of them. Through the rear window, he could see a flash of familiar red hair. His heart leapt into his throat. Could it be? Before he could process what he was seeing, the sports car accelerated away, disappearing into the flow of traffic. "What are you waiting for?" Maximilian's voice cut through Jake's thoughts. "Follow that car." Confused but obedient, Jake stepped on the gas, weaving through traffic in pursuit of the red sports car. As they chased through the streets of Los Angeles, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the precipice of something life-changing. Little did he know that this high-speed chase would lead him down a path of no return, unraveling the carefully constructed lies that had shaped his life and setting in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of his world. The chase led them through the winding roads of Beverly Hills, each turn bringing Jake closer to answers he wasn't sure he was ready for. The red sports car finally came to a stop outside a luxurious mansion, its gates opening to allow the vehicle entry. "Stop here," Maximilian commanded, his voice tight with an emotion Jake couldn't quite place. As the limousine came to a halt across the street, Jake watched in astonishment as a woman with fiery red hair stepped out of the sports car. Even from this distance, there was no mistaking her identity. It was Emily. "Sir," Jake began, his voice trembling slightly, "do you know Dash?" "Silence!" Maximilian cut him off sharply. The billionaire's eyes were fixed on Emily, a mixture of anger and something else. Was it fear? Evident in his expression. Jake's mind reeled. How did Maximilian know Emily? And why had she led them here? Before he could voice any of these questions, Maximilian spoke again, his tone cold and calculated. "Thompson, I have a job for you. One that will require the utmost discretion." Jake turned to face his employer, a sense of foreboding settling in the pit of his stomach. "What kind of job, sir?" Maximilian's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "I need you to get close to that woman. Find out what she knows, and more importantly, who she's working for." "But sir, I dash." "No buts, Thompson," Maximilian snapped. "Your job, and a substantial bonus, depends on it. Do I make myself clear?" Jake swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Yes, Mr. Rothschild." As Maximilian barked out instructions for their return to the estate, Jake's mind was in turmoil. He was being asked to spy on Emily, the woman he had once loved, still loved, if he was honest with himself. But why? What game was Maximilian playing? And then there was the USB drive burning a hole in his pocket, promising answers about his father's mysterious past. Jake felt as though he was standing at a crossroads, each path leading into darkness and uncertainty. As they drove away from the mansion, leaving Emily behind once more, Jake made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Little did he know that his quest for answers would lead him into a world of danger, betrayal, and long-buried secrets that would change his life forever. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more complex and terrifying than Jake could have ever imagined. As the lights of Los Angeles twinkled in the distance, he steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead, unaware that his greatest test was yet to come. The following day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Jake's heart. He had spent a sleepless night tossing and turning, his mind a whirlwind of questions and conflicting emotions. The weight of Maximilian's demands and the mysteries surrounding his father's past pressed down on him like a physical burden. As Jake went about his morning routine, preparing the mansion for another day of opulent living, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every whisper of wind carried the possibility of danger. It was mid-morning when Jake's world tilted on its axis once again. As he was polishing one of Maximilian's prized vintage cars, a familiar voice called out to him, sending a jolt of electricity down his spine. "Jake? Is it really you?" He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, to find Emily standing at the entrance of the garage. She looked exactly as he remembered, yet somehow different. There was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a weariness that spoke of years of struggle. "Emily," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "What are you doing here?" She took a step towards him, her eyes scanning the opulent surroundings. "I could ask you the same thing. Last I heard, you were going to change the world with your engineering skills. How did you end up here?" The question stung more than Jake cared to admit. He looked down at his worn hands, calloused from years of manual labor. "Life has a way of derailing our plans," he said softly. "My father got sick, and I had to drop out of MIT to take care of him. This job, it pays the bills." Emily's expression softened, a flicker of the girl he once knew shining through. "Oh, Jake. I'm so sorry. I had no idea." As they stood there, the years of separation melting away, Jake was struck by a sudden realization. "Emily, how do you know Maximilian Rothschild?" A shadow passed over her face, and for a moment, Jake thought she might turn and run. But then she squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze with a fierce determination. "That's complicated. But Jake, there's something you need to know. Something about your father." Jake's breath caught in his throat. First David with his cryptic warnings and the mysterious USB drive, and now Emily? What did everyone seem to know about his father that he didn't? Before Emily could continue, the sharp click of expensive shoes on marble announced the approach of someone else. Jake's heart raced as he recognized the familiar gait of his employer. "Thompson!" Maximilian's voice boomed through the garage. "What's the meaning of this?" Emily tensed visibly, her eyes darting between Jake and the approaching figure of Maximilian Rothschild. Jake could see the conflict in her expression, a war between fight and flight. "Mr. Rothschild," Jake began, struggling to keep his voice steady. "This is—" "I know very well who this is," Maximilian cut him off, his tone icy. His gaze locked onto Emily, a mixture of anger and something else. Was it fear, flickering in his eyes? "Miss Walker, I believe we had an agreement about your presence here." Emily lifted her chin defiantly. "Agreements can be broken, Mr. Rothschild, especially when they're built on lies." The tension in the air was palpable. Jake felt as though he was watching a chess match where he couldn't see all the pieces, let alone understand the game being played. Maximilian's face hardened. "I see. Well, perhaps we should continue this discussion in my office." "Thompson," "You're dismissed for the day." "But sir," Jake protested, not wanting to leave Emily alone with his volatile employer. "That wasn't a request, Thompson," Maximilian snapped. "Go home. Now." With a last, lingering look at Emily, Jake reluctantly left the garage. His mind was reeling. What was the connection between Emily and Maximilian? And what did it have to do with his father? As he walked to his modest apartment, the weight of the USB drive in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step. Whatever secrets it held, Jake knew he couldn't put off uncovering them any longer. Jake's hands trembled as he inserted the USB drive into his old laptop. For a moment, nothing happened, and he feared the drive might be corrupted. Then, suddenly, a folder popped up on his screen, filled with documents, photos, and video files. Taking a deep breath, Jake clicked on the first document. As he read, his world began to crumble around him. The document was a detailed dossier on his father, William Thompson. But it wasn't the William Thompson that Jake knew, the quiet accountant who had raised him single-handedly after his mother's death. This William Thompson was a covert operative for a secret government agency, tasked with infiltrating and exposing corrupt business practices among America's elite. Photos showed his father in various disguises, meeting with high-profile figures Jake recognized from news headlines. There were financial records, surveillance reports, and most shockingly, communications between William and his handlers about his deep-cover mission within the Rothschild organization. Jake's head spun. His entire life, everything he thought he knew about his father, had been a carefully constructed lie. But why? And how did his father's accident fit into all of this? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a video file caught his eye. With a shaking hand, Jake clicked play. His father's face filled the screen, looking older and more careworn than Jake remembered. "Jake, my son," William began, his voice filled with a mixture of love and regret. "If you're watching this, then things have not gone according to plan. I hope you can forgive me for the deception, but everything I've done has been to protect you." William went on to explain the nature of his work, the corruption he had uncovered within the Rothschild empire, and the dangers that had forced him to go into hiding. "But Jake," he continued, his eyes intense, "the work isn't finished. Maximilian Rothschild must be brought to justice for his crimes. The evidence you need is hidden where it all began, where you and Emily first met." The video ended abruptly, leaving Jake staring at his own shell-shocked reflection in the dark screen. His mind raced, trying to process everything he had learned. His father was alive. Maximilian was a criminal. And Emily. Emily was somehow caught in the middle of it all. Jake's gaze fell on an old photo tucked into the corner of his mirror, a snapshot of him and Emily as teenagers, laughing by the lake where they had shared their first kiss. Where it all began, his father had said. Could it be that simple? A plan began to form in Jake's mind. He would find the evidence his father had hidden, expose Maximilian's crimes, and hopefully, in the process, uncover the truth about Emily's involvement. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help from someone who understood the world of corporate espionage and high-stakes politics. With a deep breath, Jake picked up his phone and dialed the number David Hawkins had given him. As the phone rang, Jake steeled himself for what was to come. He was no longer just Jake Thompson, the humble driver. He was the son of a spy, and he had a mission to complete. Little did Jake know that his decision to delve deeper into this web of secrets would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life but shake the very foundations of power in Los Angeles. The following morning, Jake found himself in a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city, nervously tapping his fingers against a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee. He had chosen this location for its anonymity, hoping to avoid any prying eyes that might be watching him. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake looked up to see David Hawkins enter. The older man's eyes scanned the room before settling on Jake. With a barely perceptible nod, David made his way to the table. "I was surprised to get your call," David said as he sat down, his voice low. "I take it you've seen what was on the drive?" Jake nodded, leaning in closer. It's unbelievable. My father, a secret agent? Maximilian Rothschild, a criminal mastermind? I feel like I've stepped into some kind of bizarre movie." David's expression was grim. "I'm afraid it's all too real, Jake. Your father is one of the best operatives I've ever known. When he went dark, we feared the worst. But he's alive," Jake insisted, hope coloring his voice. "The video was recorded as a failsafe," David finished. "We don't know his current status. But Jake, if there's even a chance he's out there, we need to finish what he started." Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself. "That's why I called you. I need your help. My father mentioned evidence hidden where it all began. I think I know where that is. But I can't do this alone." David studied Jake for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'm in. But Jake, you need to understand the risks. Maximilian Rothschild is not a man to be trifled with. If he suspects what we're up to..." "I know," Jake said, a steely determination in his eyes. "But I have to do this. For my father, for the truth, and..." He hesitated, "for Emily." At the mention of Emily's name, David's eyebrows shot up. "Emily Walker? She's involved in this too?" Jake nodded, recounting his encounter with Emily at the Rothschild mansion. As he spoke, he could see the wheels turning in David's mind. "This complicates things," David mused. "Emily Walker is a wild card. We don't know where her loyalties lie." "I trust her," Jake said firmly, even as a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. David sighed. "Your father trusted her too. I hope, for all our sakes, that trust isn't misplaced." He glanced at his watch. "All right, we need to move fast. Where's this place where it all began?" Jake pulled out his phone, bringing up a map. "It's an old lakeside cabin about 2 hours north of here. Emily and we spent a summer there in high school. It's where we first met." David nodded, committing the location to memory. "Good. We'll go tonight. Pack light, bring only what you absolutely need. And Jake," he added, his voice grave, "from this moment on, trust no one. Not Maximilian, not your coworkers, not even Emily. The stakes are too high." As they parted ways, Jake felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. He was about to step into a world he barely understood, guided only by the ghost of his father's words and the hope of uncovering the truth. Little did he know that back at the Rothschild mansion, events were unfolding that would throw all of his plans into chaos. While Jake was meeting with David, the opulent halls of the Rothschild mansion were alive with tension. In Maximilian's study, a heated argument was taking place behind closed doors. "You promised me protection." Emily's voice, muffled but clearly agitated, carried through the heavy oak door. "I've done everything you asked, and now you're telling me it was all for nothing?" Maximilian's response was too low to make out, but the menace in his tone was unmistakable. "No," Emily shot back, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I won't do it. I can't betray him again." The sound of a hand slamming against a desk echoed through the room. "You don't have a choice, Miss Walker," Maximilian's voice rose, cold fury evident in every syllable. "You're in far too deep to back out now. Either you do as I say, or I'll make sure Jake learns the truth about his precious Emily." A tense silence followed, broken only by what sounded like a muffled sob. "Fine," Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. What do you want me to do? As Maximilian laid out his plan, neither he nor Emily noticed the figure lurking in the shadows of the adjoining room. Victoria Blackwood, Maximilian's rival and nemesis, smiled to herself as she recorded every word on her phone. This was the leverage she had been waiting for. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jake was making preparations for the night's expedition. He packed a small bag with essentials, flashlight, water, a change of clothes. His hand hesitated over the drawer where he kept an old photo of him and Emily. After a moment's deliberation, he tucked it into his pocket. Despite David's warnings, he couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from David, change of plans. Meet at the rendezvous point in 30 minutes. Come alone. Jake frowned at the message. Something about it felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on why. Still, he had committed to this course of action. There was no turning back now. Grabbing his bag, Jake headed out into the gathering twilight. The streets of Los Angeles seemed different somehow, charged with an energy he had never noticed before. Every passing car, every stranger on the sidewalk, suddenly seemed like a potential threat. As he neared the rendezvous point, an abandoned parking garage on the outskirts of the city, Jake's instincts screamed at him to turn back. But the memory of his father's words, the weight of the truths he had uncovered, propelled him forward. The parking garage loomed before him, a concrete monolith shrouded in shadows. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. As he stepped into the darkness, he failed to notice the sleek black car that had been tailing him, or the figure that emerged from it, moving silently in his wake. The game was afoot, and Jake was about to learn that in the world of secrets and lies, nothing and no one was quite what they seemed. The abandoned parking garage was a maze of concrete pillars and abandoned vehicles, their rusted frames like the skeletal remains of a bygone era. Jake's footsteps echoed ominously as he made his way deeper into the structure, his senses on high alert. "David," he called out, his voice bouncing off the cold, unforgiving walls. "David, are you here?" The silence that greeted him was oppressive. Jake's hand instinctively went to his pocket, fingers brushing against the old photo of him and Emily. The touch of it gave him a small measure of comfort, a reminder of simpler times. Suddenly, a sound behind him made Jake whirl around. His heart leapt into his throat as he saw a figure emerge from the shadows. "Emily," he gasped, hardly daring to believe his eyes. She stood before him, her red hair gleaming even in the dim light of the garage. But there was something different about her, a hardness in her eyes, a tension in her posture that set Jake's nerves on edge. "Hello, Jake," Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with an emotion Jake couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry it has to be like this." Before Jake could process her words, he felt rather than saw movement behind him. Strong arms grabbed him, pinning his arms to his sides. He struggled, but his assailant's grip was like iron. "What's going on?" Jake demanded, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. "Emily, what have you done?" Emily's expression was a mask of regret and determination. "I didn't have a choice, Jake. You don't understand what's at stake." From the shadows, another figure emerged, Maximilian Rothschild, his expensive suit incongruous in the gritty surroundings of the garage. "Well done, Miss Walker," Maximilian said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I must admit, I had my doubts about your loyalty. But you've proven yourself quite useful." Jake's mind reeled. Emily, working for Maximilian? It couldn't be true. And yet, the evidence was right before his eyes. Why? Jake choked out, the single word laden with hurt and betrayal. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but Maximilian cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I'm afraid explanations will have to wait, Mr. Thompson. We have more pressing matters to attend to." He turned to the man holding Jake. "Search him. He must have the USB drive on him." Rough hands patted Jake down, eventually producing the drive from his pocket. Maximilian took it, turning it over in his hands with a satisfied smirk. "At last," he murmured. "The final piece of the puzzle. With this, I can ensure that William Thompson's meddling will never see the light of day." Jake renewed his struggles, fury giving him strength. "You won't get away with this," he shouted. "My father." "Your father," Maximilian interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain, "is nothing more than a thorn in my side. One that I intend to remove permanently." The implications of Maximilian's words hit Jake like a physical blow. His father was alive and in danger. And he, Jake, had just handed over the one thing that could have protected him. As despair threatened to overwhelm him, Jake's eyes met Emily's. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something: regret, determination. But before he could decipher it, her expression hardened once more. "What should we do with him?" the man holding Jake asked. Maximilian considered for a moment, his cold eyes assessing Jake like he was nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture. "Take him to the safe house. We may yet have use for him." As Jake was dragged away, his last sight was of Emily, standing alone in the shadows of the garage, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. In that moment, Jake realized that the girl he had loved, the memories he had cherished, were nothing but an illusion. The real Emily was a stranger to him, a pawn in a game he was only beginning to understand. Little did any of them know that their confrontation had not gone unwitnessed. In the darkest corner of the garage, a figure crouched behind an abandoned car, a camera in hand. Victoria Blackwood smiled to herself as she reviewed the footage she had captured. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, she would have everything she needed to bring Maximilian Rothschild to his knees. As Jake was bundled into a waiting car, his world in shambles around him, he clung to one thought: his father was alive. And as long as that was true, there was still hope. He would find a way out of this, expose Maximilian's crimes, and uncover the truth about Emily's betrayal. The game wasn't over yet, it had only just begun. The car sped through the night, its occupant's silence save for the occasional murmur between Maximilian and his henchmen. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information he had gathered. His father, a secret agent. Maximilian, a criminal mastermind. And Emily. Emily, the woman he had loved, now revealed as a traitor. As the city lights faded behind them, Jake realized they were heading into the hills surrounding Los Angeles. The winding roads and increasing darkness made it impossible for him to keep track of their route. After what seemed like hours, the car finally came to a stop in front of a secluded mansion, its imposing silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. "Welcome to your new home, Mr. Thompson," Maximilian said, his voice dripping with false hospitality. "I do hope you'll find it comfortable." Jake was roughly pulled from the car and marched into the house. As they passed through opulent rooms, Jake couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the luxurious surroundings and the grim faces of the men guarding him. This was no ordinary rich man's retreat, it was a fortress. Finally, they reached a small, windowless room in what Jake guessed was the basement. With a cruel smile, Maximilian gestured for his men to secure Jake to a chair. "Now then," Maximilian said, leaning in close, his breath hot on Jake's face. "Let's have a little chat about your father, shall we?" Miles away, in a dimly lit motel room, David Hawkins paced nervously. Jake should have contacted him hours ago. Something had gone terribly wrong. His burner phone buzzed, startling him. The number was unfamiliar, but David's instincts told him to answer. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Mr. Hawkins," a woman's voice purred on the other end. I believe we have a mutual interest. David's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? Victoria Blackwood, the voice replied. And I have information about Jake Thompson that you're going to want to hear. David's mind raced. Victoria Blackwood, Maximilian Rothschild's chief rival and nemesis. What game was she playing? I'm listening, he said carefully. Not over the phone, Victoria insisted. Meet me at the Sunset Lounge in an hour. Come alone, or young Mr. Thompson might find himself in even more trouble than he's already in. The line went dead, leaving David with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew it could be a trap, but if there was even a chance of finding Jake, he had to take it. As David prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. William Thompson had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. What would he do in this situation? With a sudden burst of inspiration, David went to his laptop and began typing furiously. If he couldn't be there to help Jake directly, maybe he could leave a breadcrumb trail for the young man to follow. Meanwhile, back at the Rothschild mansion, Emily paced her luxurious prison of a room, her mind in turmoil. The look of betrayal in Jake's eyes haunted her. She had done what she had to do to protect him, to protect them both, but at what cost? Her gaze fell on a small, innocuous-looking ornament on her dresser, a gift from Jake's father years ago. With trembling hands, she picked it up, turning it over in her palm. As she did, something clicked, and a tiny compartment opened, revealing a microchip no bigger than her fingernail. Emily's breath caught in her throat. All this time, she had been carrying the very thing Maximilian had been searching for. William Thompson, it seemed, had outplayed them all from beyond the grave. But now, Emily faced an impossible choice. Use the information to save herself, or risk everything to rescue Jake and bring down Maximilian once and for all? As the weight of her decision pressed down on her, Emily knew that her next move would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone involved in this dangerous game of secrets and lies. In the basement of the secluded mansion, Jake Thompson struggled against his bonds, his mind racing to find a way out of his predicament. Maximilian Rothschild circled him like a predator, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. You know, Jake, Maximilian began, his voice deceptively casual, I've always admired your father's tenacity. Even when he thought he had me cornered, he never quite managed to seal the deal. And now, here we are, history repeating itself. Jake glared up at his captor, defiance burning in his eyes. My father will stop you. He's smarter than you think. Maximilian's laughter echoed off the bare walls. Oh, my dear boy. Your father is nothing more than a ghost now, a boogeyman I've used to keep people like you in line. But let me let you in on a little secret. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've known exactly where William Thompson has been all along. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. If Maximilian was telling the truth, it meant that everything, his father's disappearance, Jake's years of struggling to make ends meet, even his job at the Rothschild estate, had all been part of some grand design. Why? Jake choked out, his voice hoarse with emotion. Why go through all of this? Maximilian straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced nonchalance. Insurance, my boy. Your father may have been clever, but he had one weakness, you. As long as I had you under my thumb, William Thompson would never dare to move against me openly. As Maximilian continued to monologue, reveling in his apparent victory, Jake's mind raced. There had to be something he was missing, some angle his father had planned for. William Thompson wouldn't have left his son completely defenseless, would he? Suddenly, a commotion from upstairs interrupted Maximilian's gloating. The sound of breaking glass and shouting voices filtered down to the basement. Maximilian's face contorted with rage. "What now?" he snarled, storming towards the stairs. "Guard him," he barked at one of his henchmen before disappearing up the steps. Left alone with the guard, Jake knew this might be his only chance. He began to rock his chair, hoping to tip it over and perhaps break free in the process. "Hey!" the guard shouted, moving to stop him. But it was too late. Jake crashed to the floor, the impact sending shockwaves of pain through his body. But amidst the pain, he felt something else, a small, hard object pressing against his leg from inside his pocket. As the guard roughly hauled him back upright, Jake's mind whirled. The old photo of him and Emily, could it be more than just a sentimental keepsake? Before he could pursue that thought further, the basement door burst open. Jake's jaw dropped as he saw who stood in the doorway. "Emily," he gasped, hardly daring to believe his eyes. There she stood, her red hair wild, a determined glint in her eye. In one hand she held a gun, trained steadily on the stunned guard. In the other, she clutched a small device that looked like a thumb drive. "Sorry I'm late," she said, a hint of her old smile playing at her lips. Traffic was hell. As Emily quickly untied Jake, her eyes never leaving the subdued guard, the sounds of chaos from upstairs grew louder. "What's going on?" Jake asked, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had chafed. "Victoria Blackwood," Emily explained hurriedly. "She's making her move against Maximilian. I used the distraction to slip in." Jake's head spun with questions. "But I thought you were working for Maximilian. You betrayed me." Emily's face softened with regret. "Jake, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I was deep undercover, working with your father all along. We had to make it convincing, or Maximilian would have never let his guard down." Before Jake could process this revelation, Emily pressed the small device into his hand. "Your father left this for you. It contains everything we need to bring Maximilian down. But we need to get out of here now." As they made their way cautiously up the stairs, Jake's mind raced. His father had planned for this all along. The photo in his pocket, the USB drive, even his job as Maximilian's driver, it had all been part of an elaborate scheme to gather evidence and ultimately trap the corrupt billionaire. They emerged into the main hall of the mansion to find it in chaos. Victoria Blackwood stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her own security team, facing off against a furious Maximilian. "It's over, Maximilian," Victoria declared, her voice ringing with triumph. "I have evidence of all your illegal activities. The board will have no choice but to remove you once this goes public." Maximilian's face contorted with rage. "You think you've won? You have no idea of the forces you're dealing with, Victoria. I am not so easily defeated." As Maximilian reached into his jacket, presumably for a weapon, Jake made a split-second decision. He charged forward, tackling Maximilian to the ground. The two men grappled, rolling across the marble floor as the others looked on in shock. "Jake!" Emily cried out, unable to get a clear shot with her gun. In the struggle, Jake felt his hand close around something in Maximilian's pocket, a phone. With a burst of strength, he wrenched it free and tossed it to Emily. "The evidence!" he shouted. "It's all on there." Emily caught the phone deftly, immediately starting to scroll through its contents. Her eyes widened as she realized what she was seeing. "It's true," she breathed. "Everything. The corruption, the blackmail, even." She looked up, meeting Jake's eyes. "Even the location of your father." At that moment, the sound of police sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. Victoria smiled coldly at Maximilian, who had finally been subdued by Jake and Victoria's security team. "Did you really think I came here without backup?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's time to face the music, Maximilian. As the police burst into the mansion, Jake found himself swept up in a whirlwind of activity. Statements were taken, evidence was collected, and Maximilian Rothschild, the man who had loomed so large in Jake's life for so long, was led away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling around him. Through it all, Jake clung to one thought: his father was alive, and now, finally, they had a chance to be reunited. The following days passed in a blur for Jake. The story of Maximilian Rothschild's downfall was splashed across every newspaper and news channel. The corrupt billionaire's empire was dismantled piece by piece, revealing a web of deceit and criminality that stretched back decades. But for Jake, all of this paled in comparison to the moment he had been waiting for his entire adult life. Standing in a nondescript safe house on the outskirts of Los Angeles, Jake's heart pounded as he heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there he was, William Thompson, older and grayer than Jake remembered, but unmistakably his father. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, years of separation and unspoken words hanging between them. Then, with a choked sob, Jake stepped forward and embraced his father. William's arms came up around him, holding him tight. "I'm so sorry, son," William whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to leave you, but it was the only way to keep you safe." As they pulled apart, Jake saw the years of hardship and sacrifice etched on his father's face. He had so many questions, so much he wanted to say, but for now, this moment was enough. Emily and David watched the reunion from a respectful distance, both feeling the weight of their own roles in this long, complex game. Later, as they all sat around a table, the full story finally came out. William explained how he had uncovered Maximilian's corruption years ago, but quickly realized how deep the rot went. Powerful people were involved, people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt William's family to keep him quiet. "So I made the hardest decision of my life," William said, his eyes meeting Jake's. "I faked my accident, went underground, and started building a case that no one could ignore or cover up." "But why keep me in the dark?" Jake asked, the hurt still evident in his voice. "Why let me struggle all those years?" William's face filled with regret. "I had to make it convincing. If you had known, if you had acted any differently, Maximilian would have suspected something. Your genuine reactions, your real struggles, they were what kept you safe." Jake absorbed this, his emotions a complex mix of understanding and lingering resentment. He turned to Emily, another piece of the puzzle still unclear. "And you? How do you fit into all of this?" Emily reached out, taking Jake's hand in hers. "Your father recruited me shortly after we met. He saw something in me, a potential to help bring down Maximilian. I never wanted to hurt you, Jake. Everything we shared was real, but I had to push you away to keep you safe." As the full scope of the plan became clear, Jake marveled at its intricacy. The photo his father had given him, which contained a hidden microchip. The USB drive from David, designed to be found and lead Maximilian into a trap. Even Jake's job as a driver, carefully orchestrated to put him in a position to gather crucial evidence. "But it all hinged on you, Jake," William said, pride evident in his voice. "Your integrity, your resilience, those weren't part of any plan. They were all you. You're the one who brought Maximilian down in the end." As the night wore on and more truths were unveiled, Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The pain and confusion of the past years began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose and, surprisingly, hope. There was still much to be done. Maximilian's trial loomed on the horizon, and the full extent of his crimes was still being uncovered. But for the first time in years, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, casting a golden light over the city, Jake stood on the balcony of the safe house. Emily joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Jake turned to her, seeing not the spy or the woman who had betrayed him, but simply Emily, the girl he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Now," he said, a smile spreading across his face, "we write our own story." As they stood there, watching the sun rise on a new day, Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The long night of secrets and lies was over. It was time for truth, for justice, and just maybe, for love. 1 year later. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled and the aisles crowded with reporters and spectators. At the front, Maximilian Rothschild sat, his once immaculate appearance now haggard and worn. As the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict, a hush fell over the room. On the charges of racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy, we find the defendant, Maximilian Rothschild, guilty. A collective gasp went up from the crowd, followed by a burst of excited chatter. Jake, sitting in the front row between his father and Emily, felt a surge of emotions, relief, triumph, and a bittersweet sense of closure. As Maximilian was led away, his empire in ruins and his reputation shattered, Jake caught the fallen billionaire's eye. For a moment, the mask of arrogance slipped, and Jake saw the truth. Maximilian was just a man, flawed and fallible, whose greed had been his ultimate downfall. Outside the courthouse, Jake faced a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. With Emily and his father flanking him, he stepped up to the microphones. "Today, justice has been served," Jake began, his voice steady and clear. "But this isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. It's about believing that the truth will always come to light." As Jake fielded questions from the press, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. From a humble driver to the key figure in one of the biggest corruption scandals in recent history, his life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. Later that evening, Jake, Emily, William, and David gathered at a small, out-of-the-way restaurant to celebrate. As they raised their glasses in a toast, Jake looked around at the faces of those who had become more than just allies, they were family. "To new beginnings," William said, his eyes twinkling with pride as he gazed at his son. "And to the power of the truth," Emily added, squeezing Jake's hand under the table. As the night wore on, talk turned to the future. William, finally free from the shadows, spoke of his plans to start a foundation to help whistleblowers and fight corporate corruption. David, with his years of experience in covert operations, would be his right-hand man. Emily, her cover no longer necessary, had been offered a position with the FBI's white-collar crime division. "They were impressed with my work on the Rothschild case," she said with a grin. "Apparently, I have a knack for uncovering hidden truths." And Jake? He found himself at a crossroads, filled with possibilities he had never dared to dream of before. "I've been thinking," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "about starting a security consulting firm. Using what I've learned to help protect people from the Maximilian Rothschilds of the world." The idea was met with enthusiastic approval from around the table. As they discussed the potential of Jake's new venture, he felt a sense of purpose settling over him. He had spent so long being a pawn in someone else's game. Now, finally, he was taking control of his own destiny. As the evening drew to a close, Jake and Emily decided to take a walk along the moonlit streets of Los Angeles. The city seemed different now, full of promise rather than secrets and danger. "You know," Emily said, her voice soft in the night air, "when your father first recruited me, I never imagined it would lead to this. To us." Jake stopped, turning to face her. In the gentle glow of the streetlights, he saw not just the skilled operative who had helped bring down a criminal empire, but the woman he had fallen in love with twice, once as a teenager by a lakeside, and again as an adult in the midst of danger and deception. "Emily," he said, taking both her hands in his, "these past few years have been a whirlwind. We've faced dangers I never thought possible, uncovered truths I never knew existed. But through it all, one thing has remained constant: my feelings for you." Emily's eyes widened as Jake slowly lowered himself to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Emily Walker," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "will you marry me? Not as part of some undercover operation or elaborate plan, but simply because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with you?" Tears glistened in Emily's eyes as she nodded, too overcome to speak. As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, she pulled him to his feet and into a passionate kiss. In that moment, with the woman he loved in his arms and a future full of promise ahead of him, Jake knew that every hardship, every betrayal, every moment of doubt had been worth it. He had not just survived the game of secrets and lies, he had emerged victorious, with a strength and purpose he never knew he possessed. As Jake and Emily walked hand in hand into the night, the lights of Los Angeles twinkling around them like a sea of stars, they knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together. The humble driver had become a hero, the betrayed son had found his truth, and love had conquered all. In the end, Jake Thompson had not just reclaimed his life, he had transformed it into something extraordinary. And as he looked to the future with hope and determination, he knew that the greatest chapter of his story was yet to be written.